Thank you, everyone, for coming in. Looks like we have quite the group today, and thank you to the judges. It's a pleasure to be here after so many years and kind of share with you some of what I've been working on here. So, so my name is Michael. The final paper of my dissertation here is Architectural Misfits. And there we go, in this paper. So I look at something of an old question of why incumbent firms struggle to adapt to technological changes. And of course, we know that there are many reasons for this. One of the most difficult, though, continues to be architectural innovations. So we think about innovations, we tend to think about three types. There's incremental, which are changes that are sort of a moderate change from the existing product. And of course, there's radical changes, which are totally different, completely new. And architectural changes are difficult because they fall somewhere in the middle. So they use existing components, but they use them in a new way, and therefore require a reorganization of the firm's processes. These types of changes are difficult for firms because the use of existing components tends to hide the need for big changes. And because the components have a new relationship and a new process ordering, organizations have to retool themselves and typically overhaul the way they do things in order to make the new innovation. So to compete in these types of markets, prior work suggests something of a four-step process. So incumbent firms need to identify what the new technology will look like, how those firms who would have been imprinted by the new industry would make it in order to reach the general market, which we call the dominant design. That they have to realize that extensive changes are required in order for them to make that design. Third, they have to determine what those changes are. And fourth and finally, they have to reorganize to be able to do it. So the key point here is not only is this hard, but often even if successful, the costs can outweigh the benefits. And that's because by the time the organization makes all the organizational changes in order to make the new innovation, it loses its ability to be successful in the old market. So the cost of switching over is that it loses what was once profitable. So in this paper, what I look to do is suggest a new strategy that rather than this binary of completely overhauling the firm or avoiding the market altogether, that incumbents can look to identify approximate market segments. And therefore, by avoiding the type of products that the new imprinted firms make and using their existing competencies, they can essentially employ a niche strategy in a market undergoing radical technological change. And I studied this in the context of console video game makers and the rise of mobile games. So console video game makers had been making console games for some time, according to one design, and mobile games required significant architectural changes for them to make. And what I find here, and I'm going to show shortly here, is that by avoiding trying to imitate the new firms in the new market, they were able to carve out a successful niche for themselves, which seems to have been a sustainable strategy. And doing this, I hope to contribute two things to our understanding of how firms adapt to new innovations. The first is methodological, by providing a tool to quantify differences between products based on a large number of features. And the second is theoretical, by providing a justification for a niche strategy in markets undergoing technological change. But before we get there, I think it's helpful to get a little bit of background on the gaming industry. So there are three different key actors. The first and the smallest are the developers. They sit atop this, sort of the bottom of this pyramid. They tend to be very small firms with relatively short lifespans that design games and write the code. In the middle, we have publishers, which are what I focus on here. These tend to be larger firms, often publicly traded, which fund the games and the developers and manage timelines. And finally, we have the platforms themselves, with which you're probably most likely to be familiar, which screen the games for quality and content before hosting them on the platforms. Now, console games have been around since the late 60s, and over time, they developed a distinct design. So they tend to be very complex. They tend to have very long, protracted development process, costing millions and taking years. And they tend to make all of their money up front on the game. So back in the day, you would go to Toys R Us and you would buy a Nintendo game off the shelf, and everything that Nintendo or whoever made the game made in terms of revenue would come from that initial purchase. And of course, it was impossible to change the game once it came out without something of a product recall. As a result, the relationship between publishers and developers was something of a one-off relationship. The publishers hired developers for a project, they completed the project, and then they moved on. The world of mobile games, though, is very different. Mobile games began back in the 90s with Snake, a relatively small market until 2008 when Google and Apple both launched their respective app stores. By this time, mobile games had already begun on a different trajectory, and the firms native to that industry had begun a very different design. They focused on simple games, often called casual games, that were very small. the development process was very short, taking typically only a couple 100,000 to make and often only lasting a couple of months. The revenue model is often delayed. You may have noticed that the in-app purchases became very, very key. And so often these firms would look to have little to no price to download the game and then would look to make that money off in in-app purchases. But to do that, of course, you have to keep people playing the games. And so that led to ongoing development. So rather than making a game and walking away from it, publishers and developers would collaborate for years to keep the people playing the game expanding, and therefore making in-app purchases. The result of this, the relationship between publishers and developers had to change. Rather than being the one-off relationship, these are one-shot game, no pun intended, this became a repeat game where publishers and developers would have to collaborate for months, years, and sometimes even close to a decade for successful games. Unfortunately for console publishers, my incumbents, they struggled with this for cultural reasons. So in the old world, publishers were used to having a significant amount of leverage over their developers. As Mike Ward from Activision, a leading console publisher, noted, they had significant leverage and they used it. They would use it to set very difficult deadlines and to expand requirements and what was called crunching developers, which was very common in the industry. The developers would face these short timelines and rising requirements, and as a result would have to work very, very long hours, typically at the same pay they were expecting to get, working many fewer hours. And as a result, it led to significantly high turnover. And of course, in the world of a one-shot game, this wasn't the end of the world. There may have been unfortunate and unethical, but in the world of mobile gaming, it's problematic because it leads to a loss of knowledge. So as anybody who's familiar with quantitative research knows, nobody likes to inherit somebody else's code. And so when console publishers experienced this kind of turnover, they found it very, very hard to maintain the games, as few people were willing to step into a game they hadn't written and didn't know about, and then make changes to a live game on an ongoing basis. As a result, console publishers were left with something of the canonical dilemma of architectural changes. They could either look to avoid the market entirely, but by 2018, this market was twice as big as their home market of console games at $80 billion a year. Or they could look to retool their organizations to make mobile games. The problem here, of course, is that if they were to do that, they would have to strike a better relationship with their mobile developers, and console developers would certainly want that relationship too. And so that would mean cannibalizing their old market. And so the question is, what should they do? And so I examined this looking at 15 leading mobile and console publishers. So 15 each of console and mobile publishers. I create a sample of games from a variety of data sources, including App Annie, mobile games, and Think Gaming, to gather data on the sales, the IP, the genre, the demographics. I then perform an analysis in 3 stages. So I look for evidence that it was in fact the architectural and not the technological changes that slowed the firms down. I then look at imitation and performance and see whether or not they did, given these difficulties, seek to imitate the native publishers and how that correlated with performance. And finally, I look at the timing and sustainability of their strategies. So here I'm only going to present the middle section, the imitation and performance, to keep Hillary, Devin happy and on time. But I'll talk through timing and sustainability a bit at the end, but just to highlight just the first step a little bit. What I find is that, in fact, console publishers did enter the industry right away. 90% entered in the first year. And they were able to make games and make them at a relatively rapid clip. And they were able to get those games downloaded and even to get consumers to pay a relatively high price for them. But they could not get them to make in-app purchases, and they could not make the ongoing updates. And consistent with the architectural change about the relationship between publishers and developers, they were unable to sustain long-term developers with the developers, which I measure by prior collaboration. To measure imitation and performance, though, I need a measure of product differences. And here I borrow from the computational biology literature to use Gower distance, which provides a calculation of difference in high-dimensional space and accounts for both categorical and quantitative variables, or continuous variables. So I take the top 10 games by the native publishers, those imprinted by the industry in terms of revenue, and I measure each game in my sample to those games and take an average. I then remove those top games from the sample so that I'm left with a measurement of similarity to the most successful dominant games by mobile publishers. And of course, I use only ex-ante characteristics to prevent leakage of results slipping into the measurement. And what I find here on the left is that console publishers made statistically significantly different games from mobile publishers. They were further away from this dominant design Although you can, as you can see in figure 3, mobile publishers tended to stick very, very closely to games similar to their best games. Console publishers tried, of course, to make games all over, and including games making very, very far away. So things like sports games that cost $15, for example, which would be very, very different in terms of genre and other characteristics as well. This, of course, tells us very little about revenue. So on the figure to the right, you can see a graph of the games as dots with distance on the horizontal axis and revenue on the vertical axis. And, oh, I'm sorry here. I'm not done yet. There you go. Okay. And I think it's easier to start with the mobile publishers here, and that the mobile publishers, as they moved further away from their dominant design, saw a decrease in revenue, which is exactly what existing theory would expect. You move away from the dominant design, you perform more poorly. Console publishers, though, saw the opposite relationship. The further they moved away from that design, the less they imitated, the better, in fact, they did. And in subsequent analysis in the paper, I showed that this is closely linked to their key demographics, and in fact, also linked to, and that this was sustainable, that the gap between these two was stable, and if anything, increasing over time. Just to summarize here, what did we learn from this? The previous literature would suggest that, in fact, if console publishers wanted to succeed in this market, they would need to succeed in the way that native firms, those imprinted by the industry, would. And what I show here is the opposite. In fact, that they did best when they didn't imitate those, but leveraged their existing competencies. And doing so, as I mentioned before, I think that there are two contributions here. One's a means of measuring these differences, and the second is using that for the theoretical underpinning of this middle-of-the-road strategy. And I think that's it. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.